Larissa Waters, welcome to the program.
Hi, David. Good morning.
So do you support this peace plan announced by Donald Trump?
Well, we are desperate to see an end to the genocide and the starvation and the horrors and, of course, the return of hostages. And we hope that these negotiations will continue and be successful because the humanitarian disaster, the genocide that's unfolded, that Australia has very much been a part of by selling weapons to that conflict and by failing to have decent sanctions. We very much hope that that will come to its conclusion, but self-determination for Palestinians has to be a part of a lasting and just peace. And having foreign billionaires or folk like Tony Blair or Donald Trump in charge is frankly very dubious. So we'll keep watching to see how these negotiations unfold, but the focus really has to be on how can Australia now keep the pressure on the Israeli government to make sure that the killing ends and the starvation ends. We've put about 1,400 sanctions on Russia, and rightly so, and we've put barely a dozen on this genocidal regime. So we have called now for many, many years, for almost the whole 2 years of this genocide, for there to be serious sanctions and for us to stop selling weapons parts to this conflict. It is unforgivable that we are selling the parts that allow those bomb doors to open and, such as just yesterday, have lethal consequences. We saw that the aerial bombing hasn't stopped while these so-called peace talks are underway.
So coming back to the plan itself, some of the key principles are to see a transitional authority take control, a peace board chaired by Donald Trump with Tony Blair as a member. It sounds like you have a problem with that.
Well, look, I think Palestinian people deserve to determine their own fate and their own future government. And we want to see the genocide end, as I've said, but it's very important that Palestinians are in charge of the decision for what comes next for them.
Authority.
Not so much Donald Trump, the man who's renamed his defence ministry to a war ministry. It's just also very bizarre that putting that man in charge of anything would lead to peace. But we remain hopeful for actually a self-determined, just and lasting peace that ends that genocide.
Okay, so just to be clear on this, you don't support a transitional authority at all?
Well, look, it's not up to us. It's up to Palestinians to decide what future governance they want. But right now, they want a ceasefire and they want to stop being killed and massacred while they're trying to access aid. And speaking of aid, folk would have seen this week that because there's been this blockade of aid shipments, that a whole group of civilians, including 6 Australians, have been on a global flotilla to try to get aid to that zone. And now we see that 6 Australians have been illegally abducted by the Netanyahu regime. And I haven't heard a peep on that from the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister.
The government
we
has,
should
be
demanding.
They're contacting the Israelis, trying to get access, but they've also been warning Australians not to take part in those sort of attempts to break the naval blockade because of the obvious dangers. Are you saying Australians should be doing that?
Well, that aid needs to get through, and I think it's appalling that it's taken global civilians to try to get food to Gaza. That should have been something that the Israeli government allowed to occur. There should not be a war of starvation. But I would like to see Foreign Minister Wong call on the Israeli ambassador here in Australia to let those 6 Australians be free and come home.
Okay.
And if that ambassador's not prepared to do that, well, we should be expelling the Israeli ambassador. And we need to make sure that the Australian ambassador in Gaza is getting those citizens back and shepherding them to safety. And our government should be doing everything it can to get our citizens home safely. Surely that's their one job.
Coming back to what happens now to achieve peace in Gaza, do you agree that Hamas should play no role whatsoever in any future governing role?
Well, of course, and I think even Hamas have accepted that. But what's important is not what I think or what Donald Trump thinks, but what Palestinians have the right to self-determine about their future. That's the only way we'll have a just and lasting peace, and that's, in fact, what Palestinians deserve.
Two people were killed, as we mentioned, in that synagogue attack in Manchester the other day, on the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. What was your reaction to this, and has it changed your view at all about the danger and the threat posed by anti-Semitism?
Oh, look, my heart goes out to the families of those people. No violence anywhere is acceptable, and this is exactly why we need a resolution that is based on self-determination, and why Australia should have, 2 years ago, imposed serious sanctions on the Israeli government, who have been conducting a genocide and starving people, children. It is utterly appalling, and yet we have been selling weapons to that conflict
Senator,
and not imposing the same sanctions.
Sorry to butt in, but I am asking you about anti-Semitism and the fatal attack we saw on a synagogue in Manchester.
And we've condemned, and we have condemned that.
Are more steps needed here to prevent a similar incident here?
Well, look, of course we have condemned that, and as I said, our hearts go out to those families. Violence on any basis is not acceptable, and we need to have social cohesion, and part of that is Australia doing what's necessary to stand up for humanitarian justice, and that's why we need those sanctions, and that's why we've got to stop selling weapons components that are dropping bombs on 12-year-olds collecting
you keep
water.
coming back to the weapons, but my question is about anti-Semitism. Do you support the recommendations of the government's anti-Semitism envoy when it comes to the further steps that are needed here?
Look, we oppose anti-Semitism just as we oppose violence on any basis. Now, the envoy's reports had a series of recommendations, many of which were quite bizarre. What we need to see is an anti-racist approach to anti-Semitism, to Islamophobia, to all of it. None of it's acceptable, but I think the reason why tensions are so inflamed is that we've seen a genocide for 2 years that our government has refused to condemn, and in fact has been fueling by sending those weapons. Yes, I do keep mentioning them because Australians are horrified that our government is entering fresh contracts over the last 2 years to both sell weapons and buy weapons from that regime, and likewise to fail to properly sanction that regime. That is adding to the tensions, and we need to actually send that strong message that a lasting peace is what's needed, and self-determination is part of that. Selling weapons is a key part of that, David.
I understand that point. Let's turn to climate change and the government's 2035 climate target announced a couple of weeks ago. You've argued that the 62 to 70% is inadequate. You say it needs to be at least 71%. But do you accept that even the target the government has announced will be difficult to achieve?
Well, just firstly on the 71, David, that's not adequate. 71 is what the states and territories' existing commitments would get us to already. And this Albanese government has lowballed that and has said 62 is perfectly fine, when all of the scientists are out here saying if you want to avoid 1.5 million people being displaced, their homes inundated within 5 to 10 k's of the coastline by 2050, then you need to have far higher targets. Many are saying net zero by 2035. I'm concerned that this 62% target just delivers for the coal and gas companies that have so much power and influence on this government and on the last. And people are right to be concerned that their future is imperilled just because this government won't stand up to the Woodsides or the Chevrons or the Glencores of the world. Those same polluting companies that aren't paying their fair share of tax and are now laughing all the way to the bank at this pathetic target that will imperil us all.
To achieve the target, though, the Climate Change Authority says the number of wind farms will need to quadruple. Do you support that?
We do need far more renewable energy, and I want to mention the sector plans that the government released on the same day as the targets.
Sorry, I'll just come back to the question. Sorry, just the question was, do you support quadrupling the number of wind farms in Australia?
Well, I support quadrupling renewable energy. I have an open mind as to what particular technology will be the most efficient.
Because the reason I raise wind farms is because it is proving to be a contentious issue within the Greens. Some of your colleagues and your predecessors, Bob Brown and Christine Mill, have issues around certain wind farms, the Robbins Island one in northern Tasmania. Where do you stand on this?
Well, obviously, renewable energy projects need to be sited in the right location that doesn't have adverse biodiversity impacts.
And is this one the right location at Robbins Island?
Well, I don't know very much about that. It seems to be in a wrong location.
Plenty of your colleagues do. You've got some of your current Senate colleagues, Peter Whish-Wilson, Nick McKim, who are also opposed to it. You're not sure?
I have not. It's got to be put in the right place. And we will be looking at that closely, and it is not right to jeopardise biodiversity, but we will need a big build of renewables, and we will need renewables on households and businesses to help bring costs down.
Is when it gets difficult, right? When you come down to, okay, here's where we're going to...
Well, this is why we need environmental laws that actually work. No, this is why we need environmental laws that actually work, David.
I'll come to those.
At the moment, as you know, they don't even consider climate impacts.
Yeah, and I'll come to the environmental laws, but this project, it's proving very contentious, as I say. Christine Milne, Bob Brown, Nick McKim, Peter Whish-Wilson, they're all saying it's a bad place to do it because of the impact on the orange-bellied parrot. You seriously haven't looked at this?
No, I accept that renewables have to be in the right place. And if this one isn't in the right place, well, let's look at somewhere else to put it. We are going to need large-scale renewables in far greater capacity than we have. We're going to need small-scale renewables as well. And what we're going to need is for the coal and gas companies to stop getting an absolute free ride like they are at the moment. We saw 16 days into this new term, they ticked off on the biggest gas project in the Southern Hemisphere for Woodside, again, a big political donor who also doesn't pay their fair share of tax.
Bottom line, should wind farms take priority over some of the local environmental concerns to ensure that we can get to these sort of targets you're talking about?
We are going to need to balance the need for large-scale and small-scale renewable energy against the needs of biodiversity. And I don't think it's beyond our ability, David, to find the right location for those projects. We'd like to see government be the ones investing in those projects. And I just don't think it's impossible to site them in the right place. Okay. That is very doable. But it's going to take this government to stop kowtowing to coal and gas all of the time, giving them approvals like confetti, to turbocharge the climate disaster that their own climate risk report says is coming down the line.
I understand your point on that. When it comes to these environment laws, the government says it wants to speed up approvals but also deliver better environmental outcomes. The Greens were criticised in the last term, and you lost a number of seats, for being seen to be too obstructionist. Are you willing to stand in the way of these environmental law changes this time, or will you be more cooperative?
Well, David, just pick you up on that. It was the Prime Minister that killed that arrangement that we were about to ink for stronger environmental protection. So I'm afraid it was the Prime Minister blocking positive reform in that regard.
How cooperative will you be on this one?
Well, we're very happy to have talks with the Minister, and those talks have begun. But unfortunately, the Minister seems to be sending signals that he'd rather do a deal with the coalition for shitty environmental laws that don't protect the planet.
All right.
And
he is negotiating with both sides. That's clear. You've acknowledged that. Are there any red lines for the Greens when it comes to these climate laws? Will you die in a ditch over a climate trigger or native forest logging? Are there any red lines?
Look, one of the best outcomes for both biodiversity and the climate would be if we ended native forest logging. That should be in our environmental laws. And likewise, climate. Those laws were written last century, and they don't even require the minister of the day to think about climate, let alone to block something on the basis of climate. Climate has to be a consideration, and they will continue to be a core demand of ours. You can't have environmental laws that don't protect the environment or think about the climate impacts of what we do.
So to be clear on that, if there is no climate trigger or climate consideration required by the minister to approve a project, you won't back these laws?
Well, we haven't seen the laws yet, David, but we're sending strong messages that environmental laws that work, that actually protect the environment and act on the climate crisis, is a pretty core part of a law that's meant to be the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act.
I mean, the government argues its safeguards mechanism deals with the emissions, the climate emissions problem here, that it's not something that should be in the environmental approvals, that would slow down the approvals for things like wind farms and solar farms.
Well, the government's also talking about go zones, but what they should be talking about is no-go zones. And what I'm very interested to know that the Minister hasn't answered yet is the Bowen Basin going to be a go zone where there are 22 coal projects awaiting approval? Is this government going to continue to green light coal and gas, fossil fuel projects by big companies that make big donations to their re-election coffers but pay very little tax, in some cases none at all? That's what I'm concerned about, and the fact that the Minister hasn't clarified that yet is not a good sign.
And just finally, the other issue you raised there, native forest logging. I mean, the Prime Minister did at the election earlier this year promise no end to Tasmanian native forest logging, and Labor won nearly every seat in Tasmania. Do you really think he should break that promise now?
Oh, we urgently need to get out of native forest logging. I mean, look at the tourism industry in Tasmania. It is largely based on people visiting that beautiful state for its natural values. And we can keep those folk employed in plantation forestry. There are no losers there except the mega logging companies, again, who make big donations to both sides of politics.
So that's a red line as well. That will be a red line in this negotiation.
Yeah, protecting forests will always be something that the Greens push for. Likewise, climate action. So we'll have those negotiations, but it's pretty clear we need environmental laws that actually work.
And if you don't get those measures, you won't vote for this legislation.
Well, we haven't seen the legislation yet, David. Okay. We don't know what's in it. We're sending those strong messages on what we would like to see in it. And what we think Australians expect is an environment that's protected, a climate that's livable, and of course, action on the cost of living. Like, the government could be doing those things, but all it's doing is bending over backwards for big corporations and making life harder for people while trashing the planet. And nobody voted for that.
Greens leader Larissa Waters, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.